Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Justin Rood, and I'm the Director of the Congressional Oversight Initiative here at POGO. I'm moderating today's session. For those of you who are familiar with our traditional trainings, the rules here are the same. The session is open to all Hill staff, regardless of party, chamber, or position, including GAO and CRS. We are nonpartisan. We are non-hierarchical. Our interest here is in making sure that you get the best information you need to do the best job you can overseeing the federal government. Today's topic is POGO's new COVID relief spending tracker. This web-based tracker gives users one of the most comprehensive, updated, and detailed pictures available of federal spending on COVID-19. This session is going to discuss using federal databases, to augment data from the tracker and get a deeper picture of who's obtaining COVID-related federal dollars and why. I have with me today Sean Moulton, who's a senior policy analyst at POGO and oversees our regulatory, transparency, and federal spending and accountability issue areas. He's going to be discussing the COVID tracker. I also have with me Scott Amy, who's POGO's general counsel and editor-in-chief, who's an expert in federal contracting and ethics. Scott's going to be covering how to use other databases to dig deeper into questionable spending that you'll find in the tracker. Before we get started, I want to give a couple words on this platform on Crowdcast. It's a little bit different from Zoom and other platforms in some key ways. First, the only people on screen are going to be us. You will not be appearing unless we have a question and need to pull you up. We won't be able to hear you as well, so feel free to talk and take phone calls as you need to. You can communicate with us and the other participants in the chat window on the right-hand side. However, if you have questions, there's an Ask a Question function at the bottom of your window. And that's useful because it'll keep the questions in one place when we get to the Q&A section. And if other people may have your question, they can vote it up and make sure that we get to it sooner. This presentation will be recorded and posted online, and you'll receive a link to it afterward for reference and for sharing. The Q&A portion, however, will not be included, which is to try to give you guys a little bit of comfort in asking questions in a more of a private setting where we can be helpful and you don't need to worry about that business becoming public. Please ask questions and don't be shy. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Sean and Scott. Thanks, fellas.
Great. I'm gonna start out and talk a bit about our tracker. I'm gonna share my screen. If you're following the link that got posted and exploring, feel free to do so. But I thought it might be interesting to see some real-life examples. So this is just part of our splash screen, but one of the things I wanted to emphasize was the scope, as Justin said, of POGO's tracker that we're really attempting to get here. This is how much money is currently in the tracker: $1.5 trillion on assistance side and 22.8 billion on contract side. They have different structures, so they have to be kept separate. They can sometimes be merged together for basic things like amounts and things. But it's only in this context that you could look at something like 22.8 billion in contract spending and think, oh, that's not that much. But you see that the loans and the direct assistance are massive in what has been spent so far. But let me take you over to our actual tracker. As you see, it's pretty simple. This is sort of our alpha version. We wanted to get it out as quickly as possible. We're working on kind of a phase 2 that should launch hopefully in the next 2 weeks or so. It'll have mapping. It'll have more search functions and abilities to review the data and filter. But so these are the filters we have right now. It starts with a toggle for assistance or contracts. We default to assistance because it is the bigger piece of this puzzle. You can obviously plug in any agency you might want. You can type this in, or you can just select from the pull down. Programs, these are all CFDA programs based on their title. And then 2 location pieces of information: state and zip code. And I can tell you that most people, when we've sent them this, the very first thing they do is plug in their zip code. And it's actually quite interesting with such broad assistance spending going on. You do actually see quite a bit in your zip code. But there's a lot you can do with it to start digging in and trying to track down accountability. I've done a few searches to cut down on the time because sometimes it takes a while. This right now is pulling from a database of more than 12 million records, which is a lot to kind of sort and filter. And so sometimes it's just a hair slow. But here's one. I just pulled up contracts for Department of Homeland Security, and you see the biggest ones come up first. We see Parkdale, Advanced Materials, and you can see that this is a delivery order for 60 million reusable gowns. And you'll see that the next one down, also reusable gowns to a different company, a lower amount, still 175 million, but there's no amount in the description for the number of gowns, which is disappointing. It's the kind of thing that helps to give context to this amount and compare these kinds of contracts. But you'll see that a lot of the other contracts are again, similar. You've got contracts for respirators, emergency support services in New York. A lot of this makes sense, but it's the kind of thing that you might want to sort through and see. Obviously, you can change any of these if you were interested. Department of Homeland Security to your state, let's say Florida. You can put that in and quickly narrow down and see what are the big DHS contracts in Florida. You can sort by the recipient name once you get in there. If you want to put companies together, Brook Environmental getting to, and Classic Air Charter. Some of these that you'll see with zero amounts, those are usually contract adjustments based on the COVID situation, extensions of time, changes in what they're delivering. They don't often result in a change of cost, but it is technically a transaction. Another search that we thought would be interesting to show you as an example, this is, as you see here, I've already searched for the Paycheck Protection Program. I've narrowed, this is on the assistance side, the PPP loans that are such in demand and of such great interest. And I've narrowed it to a zip code for Peoria, Illinois, as you'll see. And as you scroll down, I think you'll, what becomes most interesting, I've sorted this by the address and moved forward so that you can see this address, 830 West Trail Creek Drive, which you'll see has multiple PPP loans, Peterson Health, Peterson Healthcare, Peterson Health Quality. We go over to the next page, which would take a second to load. As I said, 12 million records. And the transactions just continue. This one address in Peoria, Illinois, got more than 50 loans from the PPP. There was a big write-up of it in an Illinois paper. And it basically runs a series of nursing homes. And so each nursing home is getting different PPP loans, but collectively it's an enormous amount of money, an enormous number of transactions. And this is the kind of thing that you can do with the data, start to look through and see multiple loans, multiple awards going either to the same recipient or the same address. This is something that a lot of investigators and auditors use as a kind of a first pass to see if anything seems suspicious. It's not always, but it's a starting point. And again, I'm scrolling down and you just see loan after loan for Trail Creek. Another one similar to that, something we wrote up about actually. This is just a search for assistance for a zip code in Virginia Beach, and you'll see that there's a company called Atlantic Diving Supply that got a rather large amount for a PPP loan. You see over here is the program, and they got, technically it was reported only as between I think it's like 2 and 5 million, but we use the midpoint of that, which is 3.5 million as an estimate. But it's a very large PPP loan, and we did a write-up on this after someone came forward and sort of outed them and said, they're not a small business. This is supposed to be a small business program, and this is not a small business. They are the 24th largest federal contractor. And if you want any evidence of that, when you do a search in our Explorer for COVID-related contracts in that same zip code, they are 230 of the 240 transactions, getting, as you see here, millions of dollars to this company for COVID tests, face masks, bottled air, temporary labor services, you name it. They're providing many services, and so with one hand, they're getting quite a bit of business during this crisis from the federal government, and then getting a huge loan that could easily be forgiven and be sort of tax-free money for them. And so comparing and contrasting entries in assistance and contracts is another thing that we've been exploring, and we've had a number of people asking us about. The last thing before I move on to a couple of others, I want to keep this moving, is another. I just wanted to show you something like if you just wanted to look at a different program. I pulled up the Education Stabilization Fund. It went all over the country, and so you can see some of the big ones for departments of education in various states. But again, if you narrow this to a particular state, say Connecticut, you will get sort of a new list, and it may start with the state agency, but it quickly becomes a series of individual education firms or education institutions.
And Sean, if I may jump in, despite the fact that we don't have a filter currently by name or entity identifier, that will be coming in phase 2. But by using these by both agency, program, state, and even zip code, you can kind of narrow the search down and filter it down to something that's workable. It was unfortunate. Sean talked about the number of instances that are in here and the amount of data. It was just really hard to get actually a filter for that added at phase 1. But Sean was able to find Atlantic Diving Supply, even though we weren't able to do a search by their name, fairly quickly and come back with results on their contracts, their assistance. And as we're going through this, Sean, I'll jump in maybe when you get to USA spending and on the difference between our data and some of the government systems, because I find a lot less data in the government system on ADS, even when I'm searching the usaspending.gov website. So we'll circle back on that and talk about it as you move forward. But I just want to throw that out there.
Well, that's actually a good segue as the site is struggling a little bit to load. Maybe it's got a lot of people on it now. So one of the things we really tried to do, and here you see Connecticut Department of Education, you can see that it quickly comes down to individual universities, colleges. You can do the same thing, very interesting, on aviation workers support that went out. There's a lot of money going out to a lot of aviation companies, including some very small ones. I've done that before. And so it is very functional. As Scott said, as you find someone you're interested in, maybe it's a particular entry, note their zip code, maybe look at the zip code for all assistance or all contracts, sort by recipient or by address. These are the ways to start cutting it up. In terms of the scope, our main source of data is USA spending, which I'll turn to in a moment, but we supplemented that with data from the Federal Reserve, who's doing a lot of work, Department of Treasury, Department of Transportation, HHS. Right now, HHS is running some huge programs, obviously, the Provider Relief Fund for hospitals and healthcare providers, a couple of different ones that are providing testing and treatment. And in USA spending, those come out as a single recipient, basically a company that's helping to disperse the funds. And so right now, if you look at it in the government's USA spending data, you basically see it all going to Utah. And the reality is it's going all over the country. HHS is collecting that information. We were able to pull it. But, it's that kind of merger of data that allows us, as Scott is saying, to provide, I think, a more comprehensive picture in terms of where the money's going and who's getting it. So let's switch gears just briefly to USA spending.
They have tried to even more comprehensive than some other trackers, including, I don't know if you want to just mention before you get to USA spending, the PRAC and what they're doing at the pandemic response,
Sure. I was going to get to them, but we could start with them next. So as you see here, here's PRAC's. They've relaunched a new version of their tracker, and it's got a lot of great functionality. I want to give them credit for that. But as you see, when they start talking about the amount of money being spent, they're talking about less than $500 billion even obligated, about 443 billion and 353 billion that is being spent. And again, to point out the differences, 1.5 trillion in assistance and 22 billion in contracts on ours. And what they're missing here, I mean, I could go through a list, but like they don't have any PPP in here. And part of that is because of how PPP got disclosed. It got disclosed in a different format than loans have really ever been done before, because the administration wanted to withhold names. They wanted to report amounts in kind of ranges, and it made it difficult to work with. And so essentially, as far as I can tell, they're starting with information that they're pulling from USA spending. But it doesn't appear they're even doing contracts. Obviously, contracts is a smaller piece of this puzzle, but as far as I can tell, you can go into the assistance and see the same programs that I was showing you on our long scroll, but there's no way to search for contracts on here anymore. They originally had something, but as far as I can tell, and here, by the way, you can see this Optum Bank is the company that is helping to distribute HHS's money. And as you can see, they look like they get $93 billion. And the reality is it's just flowing through them. But again, if you go to federal agency information, I think it is, you can see that there are these big programs, the Paycheck Protection Program, economic impact payments that they don't have in here, which we have tried to put in at the state level, that are missing from these trackers. And we're trying to create a more complete picture. So this is useful, but it is an incomplete tracker right now in terms of what you can find. The same is true for some of the features and functions they've added at USA Spending. They have this new kind of profile on COVID spending that can be very informative, kind of telling you about the agencies and the COVID response. You got a good map, obligations. You can switch around here to look at just grants or just loans. There is some interesting functionality here, but again, and you can go into an actual award search, and you'll see they've got this disaster emergency fund code, and they've got individual ones for the various pieces of legislation that authorize COVID-19 response spending. So it can be extremely helpful if you want to track just one of these laws and the spending associated with it. I'm not sure that you can go anywhere else and kind of have that functionality. But I can tell you that as helpful as it is, it's still missing money. The CARES Act authorized a program called the Coronavirus Food Assistance Program. It does not show up when you click on these disaster emergency fund codes. I don't know why. Basically, my assumption is it's a real new feature, and agencies are still adjusting to its use, and some of them are doing a better job than others.
Sean, is PPP in there?
PPP, again, is not in this because of the new format. These loans normally would have been reported in here. PPP loans are very similar to 7A loans to small businesses. And 7A loans are in there. Disaster assistance loans are in there, but the PPP loans are not. And it's a huge, huge piece of the COVID-19 response from the federal government.
So going back to contracts, let me just ask you to do a favor for me. Show them if you have clicked, and we didn't practice this, so this may go off the rails. No, go back to where you were over in USA Spending.
Okay.
In USA Spending, go back to where you were and click on the COVID stuff. Yeah, click on the COVID stuff. And then if you want to search, you can search by name, but in the recipient, let's use a DUNS number for that Atlantic diving that you talked about earlier, and I'll give it to you. 0270 79776 and click your hourglass. Yeah, and now go click search. And now earlier you showed us a chart from our database that showed from their zip code that they had what, like 90 some contracts?
Yep.
Now
And
here they have two.
Two for 150,000 and one for 46. And let me go back and show you, trying to find the tab where I had them. Here are their contracts. And you'll see that here is Atlantic Diving 999,000 for COVID-19 panel 30 tests. 744,000 for face masks, and this is likely tagged with a COVID-19 pandemic national action interest code.
Right.
But you can see, and some of them say very, very clearly, here's temporary labor services, COVID-19, COVID-19 screener services, COVID-19 response supply. These are ones that should be coming up in, it's a great example of, the government's playing catch up quite a bit. And so none of these trackers probably is perfect. We certainly hope ours is pretty good and is improving. Like I said, we're going to be launching soon with mapping, more filters. Let us know what you need. Let us know what questions you're trying to answer, and we'll continue to try and adapt our tracker to give you those tools. But I know Scott also wants to change gears and talk about, once you have the start of this thread, other places you might go to further investigate companies and recipients that you find on our tracker.
Okay, and I will attempt to share my screen.
I will stop sharing.
And so I am going to talk about a few systems, and with them, and the first one is called the System for Award Management. It is known as SAM, which is the pages here. And am I doing this right? Can you see that fine, Sean?
Yeah.
All right. And so it is a system that tracks contractors that, or even grantees that have to register with the federal government. And this system in here, we're going to enter that same DUNS number in as you saw before for Atlantic's diving supply. 79776. And that should pull up for us a page that will show you information about Atlantic Diving Supply. Sometimes it's easier to track things by their name, but these names for these companies and contractors can be thrown off by a comma, an Inc. versus incorporated. And so sometimes the best way to track them is based on their DUNS number, or in essence, it's their social security number. And so if you come into SAM, and it's also a good way, especially, Sean, I don't know if you want to talk about it, checking addresses, because once you get into some of this PPP stuff, as you said with that example in Chicago or Illinois, wherever it was, Peoria, that you may have to track things and try to figure things out by suite numbers and addresses and some other things, because this data is kind of a mess. And so with this, when you come into SAM, you can get then information about the company, and you can check their entire registration. And so we'll give you information about the company, previous names, when they first started business, how long they've been in business, when they registered, which is very helpful because some of these coronavirus companies that have come in to help, especially in the PPE front, have come in to have only been in business for a few weeks or a few days. I mean, there were some early press stories that I helped out, and people came to us and asked us questions about a company that had only been in business for, I think it was about 5 days, and they had already received a $90 million contract to supply PPE to the federal government. I helped with a story for a television reporter in San Francisco who ends up happening to be Jackie Spears. I want to say it's Jackie Spears' daughter. And And she was doing a story on a company that previously was in the vodka business, but now is getting into the PPE supply business. And we've been following that company ever since she first came to us about it. And we were able to track them through this system. And we were able to show that previously they were a vodka company. And so I was unsure how they were going to supply the government. Not, if they were making hand sanitizer, I did hear about a local, bunch of distilleries that were jumping into the process.
Sure.
But they weren't doing hand sanitizer. They were actually providing 25 million masks. And their contract subsequently with FEMA has been delayed, and now was actually just reduced. And so I sent her a page from one of the government contracting systems saying, this, you want to probably go back and do a story or a follow-up on them, because it doesn't seem as if they've been able to do what they promised the government to do, and it's been delayed. And therefore, is FEMA out without the masks that it needed at the height of the pandemic, because this company overpromised what it could supply to the federal government?
And
Go, please.
I was just going to interject. I was just on a panel for the Association of Government Accountants, I believe. It was a conference they were doing, and I was on a panel. We were talking about some of this, and one of the people from an agency said, when we talked about this, and I was complaining about some of the lack of data, the administration's like not collecting recipient use data on these awards and putting it out there. She pointed out, she took the position that it's all about speed. We're in the middle of a dangerous pandemic, and so it's about speed. You can't have speed and this accountability and this reporting. So don't tell us to slow down and collect data. And I pushed back and said, I think you can move quickly and collect data. And she was like, lives are at stake. But my point then and now is lives are also at stake if the money gets misdirected. If you spend money on PPE that never gets delivered, then it's just as bad as not spending the money or spending it very slowly. And that's why, we need to hold these recipients accountable for the money they got.
Right. And so if anybody's interested in that company, it was Medea, MEDEA. I think they're out of California in the San Francisco area. And at that point, they've had their contract delayed. So there were a lot of different amendments to their contract. But the most recent one said that they were unable to supply, I think it was 1.3 million masks. And the cost of the contract went down from $48 million down to $43 million, which also, raised some red flags about the cost of the PPE that they were supplying, because we knew from the contract what type of mask that they were providing and what the cost was, and so we were able to figure out what their profit was on that. So, but in this SAM system, here again we're in Atlantic Diving Supply. It does give you some information. It says the intermediate owner's legal business name is ADS Tactical. We're going to see that a little later in a different system, but this gets into the parent-child relationships that you have with some of these companies that you also may need to track to find out some information on them. Then it gives you information about some of the goods and services that they supply the federal government, and it will also then give you information about who the points of contact are if you're thinking about reaching out to them. So that's a very helpful website. Now, all of these websites, this SAM system there's also called something right now that's floating around that's called SAM Beta. For those of you that may have been in this business and looking at government contracts for a while, you have maybe used to use a system called CCR, the Central Contracting Registry, FBO, which was Federal Business Opportunities. You may use something even to this day, at least for the next few days, called FPDS, the Federal Procurement Data System. They are merging all these different systems. Some have already been merged in and gone the way of the dinosaurs, but some of these other systems are coming over. And so they're going to be merged into this SAM Beta system, which eventually is going to become just the SAM system that I just showed you here. And so at that point, everything's going to be entered into SAM. And this is supposed to be a one-stop shop for finding information about contractors. Have they been suspended or debarred, which you can do even here and look at exclusions for companies if any have been suspended or debarred and put in contractor timeout. And then you will also be able to see solicitations, the solicitation notices that are out there. as well as the contracts and some of the contracting information that's popping in through that is a feeder system into the system Sean just showed you, the USA spending site. Well, SAM isn't up and running very well. It's a complete mess. The contractors aren't happy with it. The users of it aren't happy with it. But it is a way for you to come in here and you can use DUNS numbers, you can use solicitation numbers, contract numbers, any information you have to look up. Currently, it's for all award data, but assistance, listings, contracting opportunities. So when you see these contracts, one of the things that you want to definitely check out is there a solicitation notice floating around on it to try to get a sense of what the government was actually buying? Because one of the things that Sean discussed early was some of those fields were filled in well, and it told you how many gowns that they were buying. But for Hanes brand, it said, it didn't list it. Well, it may be actually listed in some other documentation that are in these other systems. And mostly it should be in this one, in the SAM system, because if you can find the solicitation notice on it, then you may be able to find what the actual government was putting in as the statement of work or what the task or delivery order was for what these companies are supposed to be supplying. Entity information, that should be the information that's in that SAM system that we just looked at. And so there's other things about wage determinations. Now, this was just going in here and just, you can do just a basic search. So contracting opportunities. And as you mentioned, the national interest code with Sean, that's just COVID-19.
I believe it's what is it?
20, is it
P20?
2020?
Yeah.
And so here, as you're going to see, and this is just, there's a checkbox here. And once again, these systems don't work very well. Sometimes it's checked, sometimes it's unchecked. Sometimes if you just even go back to look at what your original search was, it will check the box again. But here's active only. So these are active contract opportunities for COVID related things. My screen is showing 1 of 10 or 1 of 10 out of almost 42,000. So the government's still to this day buying up a lot. At least it has a lot of solicitations out that are listed as COVID related things. If I uncheck this box for active only, now all of a sudden, as you'll see, it spikes up to almost 360,000 different solicitation opportunities, contract opportunities that were floating around out there. And so this is just for contracts. And so again, if you go back to Sean's original screen, I mean, we're only talking what, 23 or $27 billion out of the, $3 trillion that has been spent. So we're not talking a lot of money over here, but there's also obviously a lot of opportunities for waste, fraud, and abuse, just like you do with the PPP system, some of the other loans and assistance money that is out there. Another system that I will just show you quickly is FPDS. Usually I just type in FPDS and it usually is the first thing that pops up in my search engine. But you will see here, reports will be migrated to betasam.gov in 15 days. So this is one of the systems that is going away that's going to get merged over into that other system. So it's really hard to do a training on all this because everything hasn't been merged over and we don't know how it's going to play out. But I'll mention this one now because they actually have something for their top requests in here. And in here is a full report on COVID spending. And so I downloaded it earlier, and it may be something you want to download now or even download in 15 days from now before this goes away. But when you download this screen, this data, this will show you all the contracting information that's out there. So there's 2 tabs here. The first one is for all that's just organized by agency, and will tell you the number of actions, the percent of the actions, but the total dollars. And then it gives you a whole bunch of information on the breakdown on the businesses that were getting that money. This, I don't want to make anybody go dizzy, but this goes the whole way over many, 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 many columns. And so, if you see, I'm already up to AD. And so we've been through the alphabet over once, and I'm only about a third of the way over in the columns. But there's helpful information in here if you're specifically interested in certain agencies. And that's where then going back to our tracker and tying it into an agency search for contracts is very helpful. And it may help you determine, why these agencies are spending this money. You can also then check on the actual contracts that have been awarded here. And as you'll see, I'm down at the bottom of the screen, but this is in here it's saying about 64 minus probably a field or two at the top, but it's almost 65,000 different transactions that they have. These aren't contracts. While the first page that we looked at was, and we'll list things by contracts, this is the number of, in essence, orders. Like one contract could have 10 different orders because they ordered $50,000 worth of PPE 10 times. And so, but in here, these spreadsheets, you can take a look at, you can organize and do certain things with, and it will also start adding in, you can start seeing who it was, who, what, why, when, where, and eventually you get to some fields, what the contract numbers are if they're there. And you will eventually get to some things that actually get to what Sean talked about, where it will give you the different types of goods and services that have been purchased, and then a description of them. Again, as Sean mentioned, the descriptions are often very lacking. It would be nice if anybody is on the legislative side of this, or you get as frustrated as we do with the description process. You'll see that these descriptions aren't very helpful most of the time. And so at that point, we can always use help legislatively on what agencies put in these things and get, it'd be nice to get more statements of work and some other things. When I did a search of this system for Atlantic diving, I then got and let's see, it's still going, but I think I got, I want to say 600 different hits. Now, Atlantic diving came up both in the name and I think in the parent name or something like that. So when it actually popped up, I think it was probably closer to 300. But again, that matches more of our data. I mean, this is a different system to use, but it certainly doesn't match that Atlantic diving that we saw, that Sean showed us, that showed only 2 contracts that were in there that Atlantic diving had for a very low amount of money. And so this tracks a little more with what we had in our tracker. And so there's a kind of a data wonky reason for this. The data that Scott's showing you right now from FPDS, as we've mentioned, it uses what's called the National Interest Action Code that's been around for quite some time. We use it to track cross-agency spending for national emergencies, for lack of a better word, but national interests. It's mostly used around to track hurricane spending across multiple agencies. We've used it for a few sort of military or international aid campaigns. And they used it for the pandemic. And so the USA spending data, even though we've got that code and it's built into the contract data, they're not using it. They're using the new disaster emergency fund code, which once again, it's the first time agencies are doing this. A lot of these contracts that you're seeing that Scott's presenting, they were done, filed, and the ink was dry on the reporting before the disaster emergency fund code came into play. And so they haven't gone back and added them, is my guess. And so it's providing a much more limited window right now for contracts. I don't know why they're trying to reinvent the wheel and not use the national interest code, but that's what this differentiation is from, I believe. Right. And Sean, I don't know if you want to say anything else about the national interest action codes, because we have, talked to members of Congress and the staff about improving that system, using it for all different kinds of things. But that's where these reports that they're showing, I mean, you can go back, Harvey, I mean, that was what, 3-4 years ago. Florence was even before that. Hurricane Sandy, that was the one that hit New Jersey. And I want to say, they're probably, 10 years ago. So, I mean, but then they also, there have been parts of, what was it with Hurricane, was it Harvey, that even though money is still going out the door, that they want to turn off those national interest action codes. Yeah. And John, I don't know if you want to talk about that just a little bit since you brought it up. So yes, I mean, it's going a little bit down the rabbit hole, but very briefly, while it's a very useful code, and as I said, it's been around for some time, it is not as, it's not used as consistently as we would like. It is done by basically a memorandum of understanding between a few agencies, GSA, DHS, and I think maybe
maybe even NASA, like as one of the FAR Council agencies. And they basically, it's rather subjective when it starts, how it gets extended. It's just these agencies. Other agencies can write to them and tell them what they think should happen, but they really have control over when these codes start and stop. We'd like to see it normalized quite a bit, have some real sort of rigorous quantitative reasons for starting and stopping the use of these national interest action codes. We think it would improve it and make sure we don't cancel them, stop using them before we stop spending.
So, and then the last system I will show you is just something called FAPIS, or some people refer to it as FAPIS, but it's the Federal Awardee Performance and Integrity Information System. And so once you kind of get into we are in the rabbit hole, I think as soon as I took over, but once you end up with some of these federal agencies and you start tracking these companies, it helps to walk through some of these systems. Some of these systems are good double checks, but this system was created to kind of follow responsibility issues. And so in here, you can do a search by their name. If you know their cage code, which is another part of their social security number that a contractor has, if they have an identifier in SAM, or if you have their DUNS number. So I'm going to run the same DUNS number that Sean and I have used for Atlantic Diving Supply before. And when you get in here and you click search, it should run and it should pull up Atlantic Diving Supply. It gives their DUNS number, their cage code, and then it gives you information about the responsibility of the company. Have they had issues with contracting, human trafficking? Have they had contracts terminated for fault or for cause? Have they failed to comply with a contract? Have they been held non-responsible? And here it's coming back no. And if not, it would have a record count. It also they have to make certain certifications to get into the SAM system and be eligible for federal contracts. They in essence have to say that they have a current, they have current contracts or grants, not a total value greater than 10,000. They do. And then they have to certify certain things about have they been held criminally liable, civilly liable with paying fines or damages, or have they been held accountable in administrative proceedings? They click no here, which marries up to what they said here. This page also allows you to track the kind of the parent-child relationship that we showed you on when I went to first SAM with Atlantic Diving, that it showed that there was something ADS tactical. Well, I think we should see that again here when you say, I want to view their corporate relationships. You're also going to see that ADS Tactical is listed as the intermediate owner. Sometimes there may be owners under it, predecessors or subsidiaries. All that information is supposed to be filled in these, but as anybody that knows these systems at all, a lot of times you're lucky just to get what you get. And you may know that there's other information out there, but it's not filled in. And we know that for executive compensation that's supposed to be entered in, this type of ownership information isn't entered in. And I know, Sean, there's some probably other things in USA spending that's supposed to get reported that doesn't.
A big one is executive compensation. Companies, both on assistance and contract side, are supposed to fill in the names and amounts that their top compensated executives are getting. And this was based off of going all the way back to the Recovery Act. It was one of those things that we carried over and continued to say, look, if we're giving someone a big contract or a big a bailout, we want to make sure it's not going into people at the top into some big paychecks. And so there was this idea of having some transparency around how much are you really paying your top executives in the midst of maybe a crisis.
Well, and especially with PPP, that may be something that comes up. We've done some of our investigations have looked at how many staff that they've had, what are the revenues, what was their, if they had other government documents, SEC documents or 990s or things that we can take a look at, what were their revenue streams, what were their assets, to see if these loans were really needed and necessary to help keep them afloat. And executive compensation was one of the things that we did take a look at, because you had some people with companies that were getting paid very, very high salaries, and they were very small companies. And it really raised questions about, the structure and the need for those companies, or may explain why they got so much money.
Right. Unfortunately, my last assessment showed, and I should redo it, but we were seeing somewhere in the neighborhood of only 10% of that being filled in for contracts and assistance. So sometimes it's there and can be very informative. Other times, most times, it's a big blank.
I'll turn now to wrap things up. First and most importantly, I and Scott and Sean are available to everyone here watching. If you are working on a project, get stuck, have a question, trying to figure out functionality, as a catch-all, I'll give my email here. Folks should feel more than welcome to reach out to me with any questions, and I will connect you with Sean or Scott. I am also here to help you with anything else, all of your oversight needs and concerns. So please don't be a stranger. You're the reason I have a job. So reach out and ask questions, and please let me know how I or other folks with POGO can be helpful. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to Sean and Scott for sharing the expertise in a project that they've been working tremendously hard for the last several weeks on and continue to. They did mention that we'll be having a newer release of the tracker with more functionality coming up in the next few weeks. We may be including demographic information, pulling from new additional data sources. Should be a lot more to work with. So we'll be looking forward to doing a training on that also next month. So if you enjoyed talking about databases for an hour with Sean and Scott, mark off time in November, because we'll be doing it again. Yes.
I was just saying, who doesn't enjoy talking about databases for an hour? This is my whole day.
So thanks for providing Sean some social interaction as well. Thanks everyone. Thanks also to Hallie Brown, our producer, for this and all of our sessions. And thank you for the work that you do for this country.